Hello, everybody. My name is David Verghese. I'm a naval researcher of the 20th century, and I write in my spare time naval biographies of Navy people who served really from anywhere from 1890 up to 1970. And I've done about 35 of those in the last 15 years. But as Ian intimated earlier, and by the way, I heard a reference to Portsmouth Harbour. I live in Royal Clarence Yard, and if I look to my right out of my window, I'm looking over Portsmouth Harbour at two whopping big aircraft carriers in the HMS Prince of Wales came in on Thursday to join Queen Elizabeth there. So it's quite a nice sight to see £6.5 billion of kit sitting there, and that's without the aircraft, of course. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a little known operation in 1941 that really impressed me when I came across it. And I'll let you judge for yourselves as I go through the talk and get to the end as to what you think. Now, the plan of my talk, I always give a plan. And this theatre of operations, what I call the true Middle East, has really been ignored in the historiography of World War II. But it was important for the War Cabinet headed by Winston Spencer Churchill. And there were certain reasons for that I'll go into in a couple of slides. And I'm going to be talking about the overall Operation Countenance, it was called, which was the first allied between Great Britain and the Soviet Union after Germany attacked them, operation of World War II. I'm going to focus on the naval aspects. And there were three sub-operations there on that day, the 25th of August. And the names of those operations are at the bottom of the slide: Bishop, Marmalade, and Crackler, which involved the army as well. So, pushing on, I mentioned that it's a fairly ignored theatre because much of the Middle East, of course, focuses on the conflict in North Africa. You're all familiar with the early part of the war when Generals O'Connor and Wavell fought against the Italians. And then, of course, we had the Eighth Army going to and fro right across from Algeria right over to Egypt and back again several times in their conflict versus Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. But moving away from North Africa, the Middle East proper, I define as that landmass beyond Egypt. And what was important there was the oil of Iran in particular, and slightly lesser extent, that of Iraq. So we've established it's a fairly peripheral theatre, but strategically, oil then, oil previous to the Second World War, oil throughout the 70s, 80s, the First and Second Gulf Wars, and look at the news today. It's very important in the Middle East as a strategic asset. During the early part of the Second War, of course, that oil was needed in Alexandria for the Mediterranean fleet and further eastwards out to India and beyond. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the geography. I'll try and do this slowly. It's necessary, and then we can move away from the detail. This map of the Middle East is bounded by three seas. On the left, you can see the Mediterranean, and the countries of Syria and Lebanon were occupied by the Vichy French forces then. We often called it the Levant in those days. In the top right-hand corner, you've got the Caspian Sea under Soviet control. And most of my talk is going to focus on the lower right-hand corner. That is the Gulf, the Shatt al Arab, from the mouth of the Gulf up through Basra to the confluence of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. We don't need the detail of the oil pipelines on here. They just happen to be on there. But it's interesting to note that the Allies had a refinery at Haifa that was very useful in the Mediterranean. Tripoli, once Vichy France had been kicked out of there, that was also useful. Note in the upper right the name of Kurdistan. This is an old-fashioned map. It's no longer on the maps, but that was where there was a theatre of conflict as well. Okay, just moving on. Prior to the invasion of Iran, which was in countenance in August 41, there were two theatres of conflict out there. The first one was the Anglo-Iraq War of May 1941. Anglo-Iraq sounds familiar, doesn't it? But in those days, Iraq, although it was an independent nation, because of various treaties that Great Britain, the United Kingdom held, they had the right of passage of both the army and the Royal Navy up through the Shatt al Arab, up as far as Basra. Now, Iraq at the time had very good diplomatic ties with the Axis countries, especially with Italy, of course, at the time under Mussolini. And on April the 1st, there was a coup in Iraq, and Rashid Ali was installed as the head of state there, and he was very pro-Nazi Germany. So you could see a threat to British interests out there from the Iraqi army and air force, and Nazi Germany pumped in all sorts of agent provocateurs, I'll call them agents, to stir up trouble out there. And in fact, at one point, the Iraqi army forces attacked the well-established RAF base at Habaniya. That was important for Britain because it had a huge landing area, lake area for the flying boats that took about 4 days to go from the UK out to India. And there was quite a bit of a land battle around there, but that doesn't concern us today. So this conflict started in May 41, and General Wavell, who was a commander-in-chief in India, this sub-operation came under India, he sent in troops. They entered Baghdad, they kicked out Rashid Ali and put in a pro-British regent there. And the Royal Navy then sailed up the Shatt al Arab quite effectively with access to Iraqi oil. And really, that's all I want to say about the Iraqi side of those waterways. But I mentioned Vichy French, and so we had that situation where these forces occupied both Syria and Lebanon. And you had the enigmatic situation when this conflict started of Frenchmen fighting Frenchmen, the Free French against the Vichy French. Admiral Darlan in France, the head of Vichy France, he allowed both the German and the Italian air forces to use the Syrian airfields, and Italy had further air bases in Eritrea on the Mediterranean. Now, their large Savoia bombers, they could put extra fuel tanks on, and they could potentially reach the Abadan oil refinery that was very, very important for the Allies. There was also a danger that they could mine the Shatt al Arab. And I think if I'd have been a military commander out there, I would have initiated that because that waterway was quite narrow and important, but they didn't mine it. As I say in there, in reality, and this is mines being dropped from the air, there wasn't much warfare. So anyway, Wavell's still around. He sent in troops in June 41. It didn't take long to stop all the nonsense there, and an armistice was signed in the middle of July to finish the fighting. So we've dealt with Iraq, we've dealt with the Vichy French countries that surrounded the Gulf. We now get to Iran, and I'd like you yourselves to slowly read what I put there as the 4 main key points of the importance of Iran to the Allies, and in particular, the United Kingdom. Now, here we are now in August 1941, And a crisis had been, I'll use the word Persia because that's what Churchill insisted. His diplomatic teams were mixing up Iraq with Iran, and so he insisted that although Persia had been known as Iran from 1935, he insisted on the use of the word Persia, so we'll do the same. Really, a crisis had been brewing since September 1939 because there were about 3,000 German nationals in the country, occupying all sorts of prominent positions in commerce and infrastructure. And the British envoys in Tehran were constantly telling the British government about this, about the important positions the Germans were getting on there, especially in the railways, the infrastructure, and the government service. August 1941, if they held the railways and the major roads, that was an important supply line to the southern Soviet Union. The Arctic convoys were being planned at this time. There was no way that the Allies could use the route from the USA to Vladivostok. Joseph Stalin didn't want to use. Logistically, it was far too far to the east. So this southern route was potentially very important for sending aid and arms and men to Russia, really, that part of the Soviet Union. General Auchinleck was the local most senior commander in the Middle East itself. And he and Wavell got together and they persuaded Churchill that it was very important to take a firm line with what was happening in Iran, because the Persians would not expel the Germans. All sorts of diplomatic ruses were tried, but and this is the Shah's that we know, the Shah's father in control of the country. He would not expel those Germans. So yeah, they decided that there had to be an attack on Persia, and that was the Operation Countenance, to try to stop this pro-Axis leaning. A way of looking at it is, what happens if we'd have lost that position in the Middle East? That's a good way of putting it. We had to defend that, because if we didn't and we lost it, we would have lost access to the oil fields, the refineries in the Gulf, not just Abadan in the mid-Gulf, but Bahrain in the southern Gulf. That oil wasn't really so good for the Navy because of its high sulfur content. Moving on, we'd have lost the ability to defend much of North Africa, and the oil, of course, was needed for the newly successful Eighth Army. El Alamein was yet to happen at this point. Looking across the northern Africa, we had valuable bases, Alexandria, other ones in Egypt, Libya, of course, Tripoli, and don't forget Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean. And that was vital for the southern axis against Germany and Italy from the southern front. And Winston Churchill was very, very keen on this I mentioned the supply routes there to the Soviet Union. And of course, if it had been lost, that quarter of the world, that part of the world, it would have in the future made it very difficult to defend the jewel of the crown in India and further east to Singapore. Remember, this is 6 months prior to Japan entering the war. So you think the big picture, and I think I've summed it up in those 5 points. So coming back now, microcosmically, to the Middle East, this is the only other map I'm going to put up there. The left side of it is the bigger area, and the square or the oblique rectangle is shown on the right there. And I'll be focusing on that lower part of the Gulf from Basra southwards, if that's fairly clear to you. Now, so it's July 41, this point, after the Iraq War. And the British government considered measures to counter the menace, of the German presence, which by that time had reached 3,500 present. Operation Countenance was put in as an Anglo-Soviet thrust, and it meant the occupation of the I try and pronounce this, Khuzestan area, which was below Tehran and to the right by the army, mainly British, but mainly Indian forces, and Russian forces to the north. So without focusing too much on the military side of it, you can see a top orange line, top left from Tabriz coming down. They were the Soviet forces. In the bottom right map, you can see Indian forces going to the right. And then you'll see one more column in the middle of the left, the middle left of the map on the left. That column was commanded by a fairly unknown Major General at the time. Name happened to be William Slim. And of course, he would go on to rise through the ranks to command the forgotten 14th Army. So just to summarize, the idea was to secure the Iranian oil fields, block the potential of the German army coming through from the north. And of course, in 1942, they actually reached the Caucasus under the Ninth Army, under Erwin von Kleist. And it was important to open that southern supply route. Stalin and, of course, Roosevelt was very keen on that. And you had to limit, in fact, end the German influence. And I'll point out at this point that Iran was neutral. I'll be making a comment at the end. The Shah that we knew in our time, his father was quite pro-Nazi, and there was a lot of growing anti-British feeling out there. We come to the naval operation. And this naval operation was the responsibility of the senior naval officer, Persian Command, and that was a chap by the delightful name of Commodore Cosmo Graham. And he worked in conjunction with the commander of the 8th Indian Division, Major General Harvey. And they worked out a plan, and it was important with these very, very limited assets to carry out 3 sub-operations. The names again I put up earlier, there they are. Bandar Shapur, the various ways of spelling it, was the railhead on the Gulf that took the railway, the Trans-Iranian Railway, right up to the Caspian Sea. I remember the road structure in Iran at this point was very, very poor. And I don't know how the Admiral, Ian McLaughlan made a comment about Admiralty names, and why they came up with Marmalade is beyond me. But and that was to take the Iranian Navy base, which is based at Crackler on the Shatt al Arab, and the last operation, Operation Crackler, was to secure the Abadan refinery in working order. He had very limited forces, and he had to divide them and prioritize them very carefully in order to make a simultaneous attack on all of those 3 targets. And this is what really impressed me about this guy. He's hardly known. His planning was near perfection. So let's look at the naval assets he had. In that command on the Shatt al Arab, based at Basra, he had 4 sloops. And at the end of my little presentation, Ian is going to focus on those sloops and say a little bit more of them. But all I put on the slide here is their main armament, which, being a sloop, isn't very much. And there was a corvette, HMS Snapdragon. He had other naval things. There was an armed merchant cruiser coming from Ceylon. That was the only ship that the head of our station out there, Vice Admiral Geoffrey Arbuthnot, could spare. He had some gunboats. He had his own headquarters ship, which was an armed yacht by the name of Seabell, and various armed trawlers. And literally the rest were what I call rowing boats further down there. And of course, he had the people at the base, HMS Euphrates, which was at Basra. So this will make the picture a little easier for us. I downloaded the map, what do they call this technique? I forget what it's called when you can get it, but it shows you that on the top left, you've got the confluence, the Tigris and Euphrates. You've got then the Shatt al Arab, very narrow waterway, coming down through Basra, past Khorram Shah, little distance from Abadan, down to the mouth of the Gulf. And that might have been about, I don't know, 100 miles. I don't know exactly. So don't have a look at that and memorize that. There's a picture of the base at Basra, big commercial place. You can see oil tanks at the back and various commercial ships. That picture was taken in 1939. And, you know, there's a fair bit of trade going on there, but oil was the main thing. There's another picture of the naval base, and that's one of the 4 sloops. I don't know which one. And, you know, you can see it's in a Middle East colors, very, very light gray, and you can see the awning there to protect the sailors from the heat. And if you look at the top left, the desert starts literally probably no more than half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from the base itself. At this point, the Shatt al Arab was fairly wide. Now then, it's now midnight on the 23rd of August. A minute after midnight, you're into the 24th. And this is what Commodore Graham did. So there's the Shatt al Arab again, Basra at the top left, and at the bottom there, we're coming out, and then 30 miles to the east, we come to the Cormusa waterway, which takes us up to the maze of waterways around Bandar Shapur, where the Trans-Iranian Railway came in. So that was his theatre of operations for the next 24 hours. And there's a nice picture of the railhead there. And that railway, strange enough, a lot of it was built with American money in the 1930s because of the Anglo-Iranian, American-dominated oil company. And that traveled all the way up to Tehran and further north. And it was administered by a mixture of Italians administered it, and the Germans supplied all the engineering now. So if any of you are rail buffs, it's quite interesting. There's obviously some goods carriages in there. Let's look at his naval force for this particular Bandar Shapur. A Cannibala is coming there from Ceylon. I'll say a little bit more in a moment. He had a sloop, a corvette, and the rest are very, very small vessels, but adequately manned for their size by his naval staff. Even used the motor pinnace the Royal Navy had left there. Cannibala, I mentioned, had come from what was then Ceylon, and they were pretty crack Indian troops on board. They called into Bombay, into Karachi, and probably as they came across the Gulf of Arabia, they probably trained their boarding parties by ambushing with a little A various fishing boats and small commercial vessels. So by the time they got to the Gulf, they were pretty skilled at occupying ships. That force left Basra at midnight, sailed from Euphrates base down the Shatt al Arab, 30 miles to the waterways, across the force to arrive at Bandar Shapur at 4:15 a.m. It was a fairly quick operation. There were, I think, 4 Italian and 3 German merchant ships there. They captured 6 of them. One of the Italian ships was scuttled, and they captured 2 Iranian gunboats, as I say there. Fairly good operation, very light casualties to the Allied side, and the whole port area was secured by early afternoon. So Operation Bishop was a success in about 17 hours. We then get to Operation Marmalade, and that is to occupy Khorram Shore. You can see southeast of Basra, where the main Iranian Navy base was. I want to say main Iranian Navy. It wasn't very large. There were plenty of people there that could be used as infantry, but they had a sloop and a few gunboats and small other ships. But potentially they could block the Shatt al Arab. They could fight, And it was actually headed there by an Iranian rear admiral who was actually known to Commodore Graham in better times. So from Basra, the sloop Falmouth led the way, Commander James in command, and the Australian sloop Yarra, a tug, and they managed to find a launch from the Kenyan Navy that happened to be stuck up there. That was his force. Yarra arrived at Corramshore at about 4:10, and rather embarrassingly, Falmouth wasn't there. She had got stuck on a sandbank. These things happen. Yarra attacked Babra and the two gunboats and put them all three vessels out of action. Falmouth at that point arrived with a company of Indian troops and two more brigades of Indian troops, remember it was partially an army operation, came from the north overland. And within hours, the naval base and the town of Corramshore was secured for the Allies. There's a nice picture of Yarra. Ian's going to say a little bit about it. And that, unfortunately, is Barbara. She took one hell of a beating, but, she had to be sunk. I'll give credit to the sailors on board. They did resist and fight to their last. So we've now done two operations, but he had a third one. And he only had two vessels left, a Shoreham, the sloop, which Ian will talk about, and his own, and Commodore Graham's own command ship, Seabell. I know a fair bit about this because I've written a naval biography of one of the officers that was on Seabell, but that's a side point. An Indian infantry brigade was coming down by land, and the army operation for that was called Operation Demon. Other than the name, being a naval audience, we don't need to know anymore. Anyway, Shoreham fired one salvo and sank the Iranian sloop that was there, the Palang. And by 5 o'clock on the 25th, all fighting around the naval base had ceased. And what Commodore Graham did, he moved his headquarters from Basra to Corramshore because it had all sorts of facilities there. There's a nice picture of Shoreham, and we'll talk about a picture of the Indian troops going into the Abadan refinery and occupying it, in fact, probably for much of the rest of the war. That's a picture of Cosmo Graham's headquarters ship. It was a converted yacht. And I just throw these in. Time magazine did an article in 1945, which I found, and I've copied the photographs out of the Time magazine just to show this was the biggest refinery in the world and the most important, just 3 shots of it there. So it was a very successful day for the Royal Navy. But, I pondered about this. I'm calling it, and it's a point of view, I don't particularly hold it, but some people might do. It was an act of modern piracy because Iran was a neutral country. So you could argue that the Navy, and it was a necessity, violated its neutral sovereignty. But I think the then Shah, that's the Shah we knew's father, it wouldn't have come as a surprise for him. He knew how important that oil was strategically, and he probably realized that his country would be attacked by the strength of the Western allies. So I'll finish by reminding everybody about the oil supply to Britain, because we obviously couldn't take oil from the Middle East through the Mediterranean because the presence of Italian and German forces for much of the war until the Mediterranean was cleared by, let's say, late 1943. So my graph on the left shows you the picture pre-war 1939. And of course, then there's a fair chunk coming from the Middle East. A lot of it came from the Caribbean, especially the Dutch East Indies, a lot of oil, and Venezuela very close by. And of course, a small chunk came from the USA. And as the war progressed, the middle of war, 42, you can see it's dominated by the US and what the US called the Caribbean. and oil from Mexico as well. And by 1944, most of the oil was coming to the UK from the US by the convoys. You couldn't send all around the Cape, it would have taken very long, but of course, there were still German U-boats around. So the round the Cape route was ruled out. I went to the London Gazette, the end of the war, and looked at the awards for this operation, which I say was very successful. Commodore Graham was awarded the Order of Bath. He became a commander of the Order of Bath. On the left, there's a load of awards, and on the right, the more military ones. The nice things about the mention in dispatches, most of those were naval ratings that hadn't got forgotten about, and it was good to remember that. That is the end of my presentation. Ian, over to you.
Right. As a postscript to David's talk, you may like to have a bit of background to the Royal Navy and Royal Navy's and Royal Australian Navy's minor warships at the disposal of Commander Graham, or Commodore Graham, and of the resin models in kit form that have been made of them. As you have heard, these include 3 sloops and 1 corvette, and a 4th early sloop now from India called Lance. First, His Majesty's corvette Snapdragon. As you would suspect, one of the well-known Flower class corvettes. Now, this class was made famous by Montserrat in his book, The Cruel Sea. She was the fictional Compass Rose. A Snapdragon was one of the earlier group with her mast afore the bridge and a short forecastle deck. Later ones had an extended forecastle and the mast abaft the bridge. Now, models of these corvettes are bound at all scales from 1 to 350 up to 1 to 72, and you can find them on Google. Starling models do not appear to have this class covered, but Atlantic models do with HMS Bluebell and may have been incorporated into Starling models because it comes up on their site. But whether they cover the early design, I do not know. Now, an example of an early version of the class, like Snapdragon, has been scratch modelled by Alan Hall at, I believe, a scale of 1 to 192. Now, before the events described by David, Snapdragon had been deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean and became part of an escort group, probably based on Alexandria. Following her return to the Mediterranean from the Gulf, she was bombed off Benghazi and sunk in 1942. Now, next is His Majesty's Australian sloop, Yarra. Now, she was a Grimsby-class sloop. Some 13 of these vessels were built in the early 1930s, 8 in the UK, 1 in India, and 4 in Australia. She was equipped with 3 4-inch quick-firing Mark V high-angle guns by the time she arrived in the Gulf. She was built in the delightfully named Cockatoo Island Dockyard at Sydney in 1934 and was commissioned in 1936. At the beginning of World War II, she patrolled in Australian waters and joined the East India Station in 1940. She then operated in the Red Sea before moving to the Gulf for the Anglo-Soviet intervention in that country, which was already leaning towards the Axis powers. Following her exploits there, she then returned to Southeast Asia and was sunk when, with a small group of merchant vessels she was escorting back to Australia, she ran into a squadron of 4 Japanese cruisers in the Java Sea. Now, these Grimsby-class sloops displaced 1,060 tons and were 266 feet long with a beam of 36 foot and a draft of 10. They were propelled by 2 turbines giving 2,000 shaft horsepower and used on 2 shafts, achieving 16 knots. Now, this class is still with us on the embankment near the Waterloo Bridge. His Majesty's sloop Wellington, and Starling Model make a model of her and the Deptford and actually HMS AS Yarra. Should you wish to build a model of the Yarra, you would need to research her precise armament at the date at which you wish to portray her, since there were alterations to armament and variations among the class. Now, the other two sloops involved in this operation were His Majesty's sloops Shoreham and Falmouth. Both were of the same class, the Shoreham class. This shot of His Majesty's sloop Dundee, another of the class, they were slightly older, though very similar design, but slightly longer, being 281 feet overall as opposed to 266. And they were built between 1921 and 1931. I think they were labelled as colonial sloops. The Shoreham was initially deployed to the Gulf, the Red Sea, and the coast of East Africa. She then went to intervention in Iran before being stationed in the Mediterranean from 43 to 45. She then returned to the Far East. Now, Falmouth, a slightly later build, was launched in 1936 and was fitted out as a communication sloop and able to carry an admiral and his staff, for which purpose they removed the aft gun, which is shown in position in this slide, having been added for World War II. Being deployed to the Far East and of shallow draft, she could enter the small ports that the normal flagship, a cruiser, could not enter, thus allowing the admiral to carry out his representational tasks in that region. Thus, she mounted only one 4-inch gun forward. She was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Walker at this stage, who came to fame for his exploits as an escort group commander in the Battle of the Atlantic aboard his sloop HMS Starling. He had a DSO and 3 bars. Falmouth was involved in evacuating British nationals as the Sino-Japanese War spread through China. She was then deployed to the Persian Gulf in 1941 before returning to the Far East for escort duties. Curiously enough, I could find no models of this class of sloop, except for micro-scale models used for wargaming. So if you want one, you may well have to face up to the dreaded scratch build. These interval sloops are well worth considering as unusual and delightful models. Right, that concludes this joint presentation between David and myself